Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 294. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. On today's show, covering some important news on the war in Ukraine, we have from the New York Times that the CIA is actually operating within Ukraine. So we'll be breaking that down and what that means for the American proxy war against Russia. So all that and more on today's show. Share the show is hosted at the Libertarian Institute. You can find it on the blog at antiwar.com. Right now at antiwar.com, we are hosting a fundraiser. And so if you would like to help the kind of independent journalism that myself and so many other great people like Dave DeCamp, Dub Bandow, Daniel Larison, Ted Schneider do at antiwar.com, please head over to antiwar.com to support the work that we're doing there. And then video version of the show, YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee. Definitely prefer that people are subscribing to Rumble and Odysee because of the increasing censorship on YouTube. You can follow me on Twitter at KyleAnzalone_. Donate to the show directly at Patreon or Subscribestar. Those links are in the show notes page. Also, the information to donate Bitcoin or Bitcoin Cash. And then you can support the show by supporting our sponsor. And this way you get yourself some high quality CBD products. PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Promo code PEACE. They have a great lineup of products. Of course, my personal favorite I talk about all the time is the sports cream. But they have a lot going on at Paloma Verde, and not just products for humans, but dogs too. 4th of July is coming up. A lot of dogs stress out during, hearing the loud noises, the fireworks and stuff like that. And so a lot of people are telling me that, hey, the CBD dog treats at Paloma Verde work really well. I really like them, and they help my dog to calm down and relax. So with playing on, you're going to have some loud noises coming up here for the 4th of July, people celebrating with fireworks, want to be able to have a little bit of stress release for your dog. Think about, getting some Paloma Verde dog treats the next time you do your CBD shopping. Whatever you do, use the promo code PEACE when you check out. That'll save you 20%, and it gets the show a kitbat. Those kitbats really do help the show cover costs that, it takes to produce, upload shows, make sure everything looks good and nice as the show typically does. And so when you do your CBD shopping at Paloma Verde, you really do help the show continue and to improve. So PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Promo code PEACE. And now it is time to get into the news. The first article I have today I wrote for antiwar.com on June 26th. CIA European commandos operating on the ground in Ukraine, according to the New York Times. Previous reporting from the New York Times and CNN said the White House had incomplete intelligence about the war because it lacked personnel in Ukraine. And so I'll get into all this. I think there's a lot to break down here. I'll have quite a bit of analysis on this story, I think, because not only it's so important, but it does contradict some previous reporting from the mainstream media. So I write, the New York Times reports CIA officers are in Kiev to pass intelligence to Ukrainian officials, and special operation forces from several allied countries are training Ukrainian troops near the battlefield. The covert operations in Ukraine are part of a significant effort by Western governments to weaken Russia. Citing unnamed current and former officials, the New York Times explains the CIA has secretly deployed to Kiev to give intelligence to the war to officials in Ukraine. This is Eric Schmidt writing for the New York Times. CIA personnel have continued to operate in the country secretly, mostly in the capital Kiev, directing much of the massive amount of intelligence the United States is sharing with Ukrainian forces. Some Ukrainian military officers say the American intelligence is having an impact on the battlefield. The New York Times describes the process as the CIA making satellite photos available to Ukrainian forces near the front lines with tablets. Kiev soldiers can use the tablets to access a battlefield mapping app to assist in targeting Russian troops. The report from the New York Times is the first admission that Americans are on the ground in Ukraine. President Joe Biden has pledged not to deploy American forces to Ukraine and withdrew 150 soldiers training Ukrainian forces before Russia invaded on February 24th. However, several of America's NATO allies have filled that void. According to the New York Times, special operations forces from Britain, France, Canada, and Lithuania are training Ukrainian forces near the front lines. The role of the commandos is to train and advise Ukrainian troops and provide a conduit for weapons. Smith admits his article does not provide the complete activities of the CIA and European commandos in Ukraine. And so I think this is very important and something to really talk about, and I haven't seen discussed in a lot of articles, that this isn't everything the CIA is doing, right? They're not just passing intelligence to Ukrainian officials. We know that they are now in Ukraine and that they are passing intelligence to Ukrainian officials, but likely doesn't consume all the time of the CIA officers. And so what else are they doing in Ukraine is a huge question mark. I guess with the European commandos training forces, especially near the front lines, is probably more of a full-time job. And but as far as it goes, are they actually doing any fighting? You know, we've seen a lot of times in the Middle East that training operations are really just Western-led operations. So the American forces are there, they're leading the operations. Maybe they're not the first people to go through the door after they kick it down, but they're definitely there as a part of the team, putting themselves in harm's way. And so you know, should be real questions as to the governments of France, Britain, Canada, and Lithuania. What kind of precautions are you taking to make sure that, you know, we don't end up with British soldiers shooting and killing or being shot and killed by Russians on the ground in Ukraine because of how quickly this could spiral out of control? So this is, I think, a lot of the, you know, the big important news here is what's being reported. Now, this is the New York Times, this is Eric Schmidt, and so we should take everything with a grain of salt. However, I think more than likely what we're going to find in the coming months is this was just an incomplete picture of what the CIA has been doing in Ukraine, not really giving us the full amount of information of what the CIA's activities are, rather than the CIA not actually being there. However, we do have this kind of interesting contradiction between previous reporting from the New York Times and CNN that I noted at the end of my article. The presence of CIA officers and commandos in Ukraine appears to contradict previous stories in the CNN and New York Times. On June 8th, Julia Barnes wrote in the New York Times that U.S. intelligence community had blind spots in Ukraine. On April 19th, a CNN article noted the White House can only monitor weapons entering Ukraine for a short time before they enter into a black hole, and the U.S. has almost zero ability to track the weapons. Both reports emphasized the U.S. intelligence community's lack of operations within Ukraine to explain their inability to collect more complete intelligence on the war. And yeah, you know, so I think this is a real contradiction and kind of a mystery to me, almost particularly on the weapons, because if the UK and Lithuania and France and Canada are all funneling the weapons, you know, from Lviv all the way to the Donbass and to the front lines, the idea that the Americans have no idea who these weapons are going to seems very, very odd and unlikely. It seems that if the American, now maybe there's a plausible deniability thing here, like the Brits are doing it and the Americans don't ask, and that's just the way that the Americans like it and want it to be. But you know, these aren't intelligence gaps, then it's just willful ignorance. And so this should raise a lot of questions around the Western proxy war, how involved we are in helping Ukraine, how much of this is really just a direct fight in Ukraine, using Ukrainian bodies as, you know, the bullet bags for the Russian soldiers, and, you know, using Ukrainians to fire weapons to kill Russians. And I think that as the evidence emerges, it's more and more becoming that scenario where we are essentially running this war for the Ukrainians. And, again, they're just the soldiers taking order. They're just the cannon fodder. And this is all about weakening Russia from the Western perspective. Now, maybe even more troubling, and I know that that last article is very scary, maybe even more troubling, that was the article I wrote yesterday for the Libertarian Institute. Russian lawmakers urge strikes on U.S. Embassy in Kiev in response to U.S.-made long-range rockets reaching Ukrainian battlefield. According to a top military official in Kiev, the American-made high-mobility artillery rocket system, HIMARS, have begun hitting Russian targets. In response, a lawmaker in Moscow wants Russian forces to destroy the American embassy in Kiev. Chief of Ukraine's General Staff reports the HIMARS, is the abbreviation they use, have been used against Russian forces on the battlefield. Artillerymen of the armed forces of Ukraine have skillfully hit certain targets and military targets of the enemy on our Ukrainian territory. So far, the U.S. has transferred 4 HIMARS to Ukraine and promised 4 additional systems. Now, somebody asked on Twitter how I know that the U.S. is transferring these. I don't, but Russia says, they're there and responding to the West as if they were there. And then Ukraine says they're there. The U.S. says they're there. And so I guess even if they're not actually there and not killing people on the battlefield, are there in Ukraine being destroyed, the fact that all the parties have all apparently agreed to pretend that they're there, kind of makes it so that we should just report it and treat it like it's there, because, the way that things escalate are going to happen. But I do think that they're likely on the battlefield, given that essentially every party is reporting at this point that those systems have been deployed. And the U.S. has promised 4 additional systems. However, the training Ukrainian forces to fire the long-range rockets is a separate obstacle. So far, the Pentagon reports training 60 Ukrainian soldiers on the rocket systems. The second group is now undergoing training in Germany. General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, says training takes a bit of time, but the U.S. has reduced the course from 6 to 2 weeks. Milley notes the training is crucial. It's no good to just throw the systems onto the battlefield, he said. Moscow warned NATO supplying the long-range rockets to Kiev would provoke a stern response. On Thursday, the deputy chairman of the Russian Parliament's Defense Committee stated that the Kremlin should target the U.S. Embassy in Kiev to respond to the deployment of the HIMARS. The center of the decision-making is the U.S. Embassy. My position is that we need to destroy the government quarter in Kiev. We need to destroy the relevant points. He added, "We will not stand by and watch this mess. While they slap us on one cheek, we will not turn the other." And so, I think a couple important things to mention here. While obviously this guy is a real hawk, right? Maybe this is like the Lindsey Graham, John McCain, Joe Lieberman, whatever you want to say, of the Russian Duma, that this guy is very aggressive, right? And we're not hearing these kind of statements necessarily from the Kremlin. So that's important. However, I do think he is, in a position of power. He's the deputy chairman of the Defense Committee. So this is, probably like an Adam Smith type role, level of power in the Congress. And he is identifying that the U.S. Embassy is the center of the decision making. Now, maybe he's overstating it, but what we've, learned in just recently from the New York Times about the CIA operating in Ukraine and passing intelligence, this could suggest that the U.S. really is running it. And so, look, even I'm not saying that he's right to say the U.S. Embassy should be destroyed. This seems like a really significant and unnecessary escalation. He could still be right that the war is essentially being run out of the U.S. Embassy in Kiev at this point. And then, I do think there is a real expectation in the West that every time we escalate, Russia won't. And so this last quote, I do think was, just something to think on, that, while they slap us on one cheek, we will not turn the other. Russia's not going to do that anymore. They are going to respond to escalation by escalation. I wrap up the article saying, Since Russia invaded Ukraine 4 months ago, the U.S. and NATO partners have provided tens of billions of military assistance to Kiev. The HIMARS are some of the most advanced weapons the U.S. has sent to Ukraine. The White House has approved munitions for the systems that have a range of 50 miles. And so, of course, there was a lot of concern that these systems could be used to strike targets within Russia. Now, the White House claims that they got assurances from Kiev that these systems would not be used for those purposes. But, I think in one sense, good luck with that. We also had on Sunday Russia carrying out a barrage of missile strikes against more urban targets in Ukraine, including at least 4 missiles hitting the capital city of Kiev. Ukrainian officials claim an apartment block and a kindergarten was I think damage. The missile hit outside of the kindergarten, but the school building itself was still damaged in the attack. And then in total, 1 person was killed and 6 people were injured in Kiev. Again, this was all early reporting. Things could change. The Ukrainians could be playing up certain aspects of it or whatever, but that is reported to have happened on Sunday. There was some speculation that was happening because Western nations were kicking off the G7 summit in Germany. That's certainly possible. It could also just be a reaction to everything else going on. Lithuania barring rail going to Kaliningrad. That's really huge. Russia is making a lot of threats around that. And also just the weapons transfers to Ukraine could also be pushing or provoking Russia. There is a new weapons package that has been announced. This Dave DeCamp on June 23rd at antiwar.com. This is actually a wrong article here. This is the article that I'm looking for. Biden authorizes new $450 million weapons package for Ukraine. On Thursday, President Biden authorized a new $450 million weapons package for Ukraine that includes more of the HIMARS. I already noted that they're sending more, so that was, I believe, in this package. And then, according to the Pentagon, the package will have 36,000 rounds of 105 millimeter ammunition, 18 tactical vehicles to tow 155 millimeter artillery, 1,200 grenade launchers, 2,000 machine guns, 18 coastal and riverine patrol boats, spare parts, and other equipment. The new bundle was funded by the $40 billion Ukraine aid bill that Biden signed into law back in May. The $450 million was authorized using the president's drawdown authority, which allows the president to send weapons to Ukraine from U.S. military stockpiles. Including the initial $13.6 billion aid bill for Ukraine, the U.S. has authorized about $54 billion to be spent on the war in Ukraine. The funds are meant to last through the 2022 fiscal year, which ends September 30th for the government, 9/30 for the government. So that's only a couple more months for all this money that we've been sending. All right. Now, there was a report yesterday that I read in MSN, but then they took the story down. But they had a quote in there from the Russian government about Russia being responsible for killing 80 Poles who had gone to Ukraine to fight. So I thought that was interesting. Just wanted to mention all that. Now on to this story about Lithuania. Lithuanian president wants hike in military spending, more NATO troops. Lithuania's president wants his country to hike military spending to 3% of gross domestic product to enable it to host more NATO troops, as the Baltic nations are hoping for a significant increase in the alliance's presence in the region. An increase in NATO's presence in Eastern Europe and the Baltic states is expected to be announced at the Madrid summit that's this coming week, but the alliance is divided over how big a military buildup will be. Lithuania's president told Reuters this week that he hopes Lithuania can host a brigade by 2027. Infrastructure-wise, we are not ready to deploy a brigade-sized unit in Lithuania because there is no accommodation infrastructure here. I hope by 2027 we will be ready. And so that, that's kind of where we get the mindset of the Lithuanians. And as I mentioned, particularly between Lithuania and Moscow, tensions seem to be spiraling because of Lithuania's decision not to allow sanctioned items to be transported from Russia proper to the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad through Lithuania. Now, I've read that, Russia is apparently considering giving some, new weaponry to Belarus in response to that. And I could see this being extremely significant escalation that we're looking at here in the Baltic region because of this move by Lithuania. All right. We have this from Dave DeCamp on June 23rd at antiwar.com. European Union grants candidate status to Ukraine and Moldova. European leaders on Thursday granted Ukraine and Moldova candidate status, the first official step towards membership for the former Soviet states, although the full process will take years, potentially over a decade. The Ukrainian people belong to the European family. Ukraine's future is with the EU, said Josep Borrell, UE's foreign policy chief. Today marks the beginning of a long journey that we are willing to walk together. The decision for Ukraine was viewed by Western media as a symbolic victory for Ukraine as it is battling Russian forces in the Donbass. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said the EU decision was a unique and historic moment. Russian President Vladimir Putin said last week he doesn't care if Ukraine joins the EU because it's not a military alliance. Now, a few more European-centered stories here that I just wanted to touch on. The UK wants to deport any Ukrainians. Well, the UK is planning to deport any asylum seekers, refugees who show up to the UK without appropriate paperwork to Rwanda. But this is also going to include Ukrainians. And then, I have this quote from Boris Johnson, and then I'll talk about the G7 mocking of Putin. So, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson said Russia's victory in Ukraine would have catastrophic consequences for the world that are absolutely catastrophic, and said Joe Biden is currently spending $46 billion to help Ukraine. I would argue that the price is worth paying for democracy and freedom. And so, this is the president, not the prime minister, the leader of another country, saying that it's worth it for the Americans to spend $46 billion to aid and arm Ukraine. Of course he thinks that, but this is just absolutely insane. It should be very telling to us. Now, the last thing, or not the last thing, but another note on some of the way that things are going in Europe right now. At the G7 summit, the several leaders of Western countries mocked Vladimir Putin over some old shirtless photos. He's like on a horse in one, he's fishing in another one. These are pretty memeable and everything like that. You see him a lot on the internet. Canada's Justin Trudeau said something about a bare-chested horseback riding, and European Commissioner Ursula von der Linden said, "Oh yes, horseback riding is the best," and they were trying to, make fun of Putin. I believe Boris Johnson also said something here. Now, look, I don't want to make fun of people for being out of shape or anything, but Boris Johnson probably isn't the kind of guy that should be mocking Vladimir Putin for going shirtless, since I don't think he would get quite the positive reception that Putin got if he didn't have a shirt on. But the reason I brought this up is I think it's very actually telling, right? That we spent 4 years from 2016 to 2020 hearing how there's no adults in the room. The Europeans and the Americans are having conflicts because Trump doesn't know how to negotiate or diplomacy. And here you now have the adults back in the room, right? You have Biden and Trudeau and all these other enlightened Western liberals that are, sitting in this room together. And where they're mocking the leader they're at war with. Rather than trying to create fertile ground for discussion, they're acting like high schoolers. And it's just unacceptable. And, this really should be something that I think actually gets condemned by like actual foreign policy experts as just being unnecessarily juvenile and provocative, but I highly doubt we're going to see that. All right, next article from Dave DeCamp. NATO chief wants Finland, Sweden to join alliance soon, but can't guarantee it. On Wednesday, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says he wants Finland and Sweden to join the Western military alliance soon, but that he can't guarantee it as Turkey's objections have blocked swift application process. My aim is to make sure that they, Sweden and Finland, can join, the NATO chief said at an event hosted by Politico. I can't guarantee it, but I'm saying that's my aim. Stoltenberg has repeatedly tried to play down Turkey's stance and said it's not the first time we see one or just a few allies not agreeing with the rest, but officials in Ankara made clear they won't lift the objection unless Finland and Turkey take steps to address their concerns. Now, I will say there is a report from Turkey, from the Turkish government, that Erdogan will meet with, that's the Turkish president, will meet with the presidents or the leaders of Finland and Sweden before the Madrid summit on June 29th and 30th later this week. And so maybe there's a possibility that, they are holding this meeting to break Turkey's roadblock so they could have a major announcement in Madrid. I wouldn't necessarily be surprised if that was the case. And then we have the Defense Department lobbying Congress to quickly approve Finland and Sweden's NATO membership. So even if, Turkey continues to throw up the roadblock, my guess is that the Senate will go ahead and ratify Finland and Sweden joining NATO with Turkey's roadblock in place. And so, that is going to be on the books here in the U.S. All right, last article here on Russia that's pretty interesting. Dave DeCamp on June 22nd. Putin says Russia will redirect exports to BRITS nations. Russian President Vladimir Putin told a meeting of BRITS leaders on Wednesday that Russia is actively redirecting trade flows to the BRITS countries as Moscow is facing sanctions. BRITS is an acronym for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, which together represent more than 40% of the world's population. Russia's BRITS partners have not allowed the U.S. led sanctions campaign, and some have stepped up Russian oil imports as Western countries have been banning the commodity. China, the world's largest oil importer, has significantly increased its purchase of Russian oil, resulting in Russia overtaking Saudi Arabia as Beijing's top oil supplier. In May, China imported 1.9 million barrels of oil per day of Russian crude, an increase of 55% from May of last year. Asia has also outpaced Europe as the largest buyer of Russian oil. And so this is just another indicator of why the sanctions are failing. So we should now move on, and I got an article here on China that I wrote yesterday for antiwar.com. Biden will use European tour to step up Western pressure on China. And so, we really expect that Biden in this G7 meeting and the NATO meeting this coming week to focus a lot of attention on Russia, which will absolutely be the case. But they are going to take very important steps in increasing the Cold War with China as well. This week, President Joe Biden is traveling to Europe for meetings with NATO and the Group of Seven. The White House plans to use the summits to increase Western pressure on China. Biden is currently in the German Alps on the first leg of his trip. On Sunday, he met with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz to kick off the G7 summit. During the meeting, Biden announced $600 billion global infrastructure initiative to combat China's Belt and Road initiative. Washington claims Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative invests money in developing countries but uses the debt to coerce governments into adopting pro-China policies. A senior U.S. official speaking with reporters said Western nations believe Early participants in BRI are experiencing buyer's remorse, and the G7 initiative would have an edge. The president said the U.S. will contribute by mobilizing $200 billion in grants, federal funds, and private investment over 5 years. According to Biden, the 5-year plan, dubbed the Partnership for Global Infrastructure, will target climate change, global health, gender equality, and digital infrastructure. He indicated the initiative will also be used to further his foreign policy goal of promoting democracy. We will see the concrete benefits of partnering with democracies, Biden said. The initiative is similar to a proposal made at last year's G7 summit called Build Back Better World. Politico labeled the Partnership for Global Infrastructure a mere rebrand of Build Back Better World and claims the new proposal will likely meet the same fate. Much of the funding behind the new plan appears aspirational and seems to fall short of lofty goals, Politico reported. After the German-hosted G7 summit, Biden will travel to Spain to meet with NATO leaders. While Russia will be at the forefront in discussion, the White House hopes the alliance will adopt a more aggressive policy, China policy. Russia's war against Ukraine has galvanized our partnerships around the world. It is also showing Ukraine is not taking its eye off the ball. In fact, off the ball on China. In fact, it's quite the opposite. At a meeting in Madrid, NATO will release a new strategy document. Washington intends to influence other Western leaders to include strong language targeting Beijing. Leaders will also advance a version of the world grounded in freedom and openness, not coercion, not aggression, not spheres of influence. They will strengthen our cooperation on economic issues, cyberspace, and quantum computing, and in particular, the challenges posed by China, an official told Reuters. While previous NATO security documents mention China, the new security strategy will identify Beijing as an adversary. Chinese officials have condemned the American plans. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin said NATO is a product of the Cold War and the world's biggest military alliance dominated by the U.S. It's a tool for the U.S. to maintain hegemony and influence Europe's security landscape, which is clearly against the trend of our times. NATO has already disrupted stability in Europe. It should not try to do the same in the Asia Pacific and the whole world, he added. So, you know, when you do see the U.S. is trying to include strong language targeting Beijing, you got to wonder if this is absolutely meaningless. But I don't think it is. I think this is about making sure that NATO has a purpose post-Ukraine war, and that purpose is going to be increasing tensions with China. And we're going to see more and more of that, especially as things in Ukraine will eventually wind down at some point. And then Dave DeCamp had a similar article last week at the antiwar.com. NATO chief says alliance will address China's security concerns at the Madrid summit. And Stoltenberg said, we will address China and under the consequences for our security. I think I would understand that for NATO. More of, alliance officials adding to this. Last story on China here. I believe this is the last story I have on China. I actually have two more important things after this, but this is very important as well. Emails reveal USAID officials were alarmed over China Solomon Islands pact. Newly released internal emails from the United States Agency for International Development revealed officials in the agency were very alarmed by the news China and the Solomon Islands had agreed to a security pact. I guess a couple of important things here. One, it really shouldn't be alarming that the Solomon Islands is doing anything for the United States. We are the world empire. If the Solomon Islands sign a security pact with China, we really shouldn't care. It should be considered inconsequential. The fact that the U.S. made such a big deal out of it probably makes it a bigger deal than it actually is. But at the same time, if the U.S. probably just didn't care as much. The Solomon Islands and other countries wouldn't be so concerned about signing security pads with China in the first place. But also, it is an indication that U.S. intelligence is either, first of all, shaky, or maybe USAID is cut out of the intelligence loop, and maybe that has something to do with internal White House politics surrounding USAID chief Sam Power. The U.S. has went ahead and enacted and started enforcing a law that is going to, the law is titled the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, and it's going to prevent imports from goods from China's Xinjiang region unless companies can provide clear and convincing evidence that no component was produced with slave labor. The controversial rule has upset the Chinese government, which characterized the U.S. claims about its oppression of the members of its ethnic Uyghur minority as vicious lies. On the show in the past, I've done a lot of work with Patrick McFarlane on the topic of the repression on the Uyghurs, if you want to look into that. Of course, if U.S. lawmakers are really concerned with products being made or, with slave labor, the first place that we should probably look is the U.S. prison system. But back to some news on this. The act is causing concern among U.S. businesses, which say the federal government has not provided significant guidance on the steps that must be taken to avoid having imports seized at the U.S. border. Experts warn that the compliance law will be difficult for many U.S. businesses because the complexity of their supply chains and the lack of reliable third-party auditors in China who could testify that specific goods are not made with forced labor. Some are concerned that it will force businesses to abandon the region entirely, and that may not be the greatest situation, just because there are a lot of Uyghurs that live there, and them having some work to do probably helps their, prosperity. The law was passed with bipartisan support in Congress in December, and this past Tuesday, a week ago, marked 180 days since the bill was signed, the deadline for implementation. China's spokesperson, Liu Ping, said that the U.S. ad totally violates the market principles and commercial ethics. Such moves will only undermine the stability of the global infrastructure and supply chains, disrupt international trade, and hurt the U.S. own interest and credibility. Despite that being a comment from the Chinese government, my guess is that's pretty true. We also had further escalation between the U.S. and China. Taiwan ended up scrambling its jets last week to warn away 29 Chinese aircraft. I think it was like 23 maybe fighter aircraft and 6 bombers that were in China's ADIZ. Remember, as I always talk about on the show, the ADIZ is not the same thing as airspace. It's a much wider area and essentially stretches over mainland China, halfway between Taiwan and the Philippines. And so China entering it isn't a huge deal, but it is, I think, meant to be provocative by Beijing and to express China's unhappiness with the U.S. and its increasing ties with Taiwan. U.S. commander says Russia and China partnership means U.S. must prepare for attack on Guam. The head of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command on Friday sounded the alarm that China and Russia's growing cooperation, calling it dangerous, and accused Beijing of the largest military buildup since World War II. The admiral said that China's actions mean that the U.S. should spend more money on building up Guam's defenses. Indo-PACOM is seeking additional funds for a program known as the Pacific Defense Initiative, and part of that plan is to build up U.S. military facilities in Guam. And so this is pretty crazy that they want to spend all this money in Guam. All right, last article I have today is, what? I am just going to skip this one and wrap up the show there. Thank you, everybody, for tuning into today's show. Sorry, a little bit of the articles were disordered, but I will have another show out later this week, and I will be sure to cover USAID and the State Department stonewalling the U.S. Afghan Inspector General as he tries to look into what happened with the fall of Kabul and the aid that is being transferred from the U.S. to Afghanistan now. So, again, thank you so much for tuning into the show. I'll be back with more later in the week, and just be sure to share if you can. Follow me on Twitter at Anzalone _.